There's a quiet kind of suffocation in the way life can settle into a rhythm you never questioned. Tom and I were never one of those couples that seemed to have drama, tension, or grand emotional outbursts. Our marriage was the kind that could be seen as comforting from the outside, predictable, steady, and comfortable. But when you live with someone long enough, that predictability begins to feel like a cage, and the comfort like a blanket too warm for summer. At first, it was small things I noticed. The way Tom's voice would fade into the background during our conversations, or how his presence, once so steady, now felt distant in the room. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone goes through phases, right? We'd been married for over 10 years. There were always things that pulled us apart. Work, family, the demands of everyday life. I still cared about him. I had to. And yet, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that something vital was missing. It wasn't that I didn't love him. It was more that I felt unseen. It wasn't until one particularly lonely afternoon, when I found myself sitting by the window, staring out at the street below, that the feeling truly sank in. There had been no argument, no falling out. Just silence. The world seemed louder than ever. And yet, here I was, shrinking into myself, growing invisible. It wasn't planned. In fact, when I first met Jack, I barely thought anything of it. He was someone I worked with, another face in a sea of colleagues who blurred together in the daily rush of office life. But there was something in the way he spoke to me, a sincerity that felt different from the usual pleasantries we exchanged at work. He listened when I spoke, really listened. At first, I assumed it was just kindness, a rare quality these days. But there was a certain warmth in his attention that lingered with me longer than I cared to admit. We started talking during lunch breaks, usually in small groups, then alone as time went on. His sense of humor was dry, but his smile, oh, that smile, had a way of reaching me in a way I hadn't felt in years. He made me laugh, truly laugh, something that seemed rare these days. I told myself that it was nothing, just a harmless connection. Tom had never been particularly outgoing, and our routine was comfortable, if a little dull. So I allowed myself to engage with Jack, to enjoy the easy back and forth of our conversations. He never overstepped. His kindness was quiet and unassuming, and I felt myself drawn in. It felt good to be seen, to be heard, things that had been so scarce at home. As the weeks went on, I found myself looking forward to seeing Jack. The comfort of our conversations was intoxicating. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I couldn't deny the pull he had on me. There were moments I would catch myself, standing a little too close to him when we spoke, lingering a moment too long after a joke had been made. But I never acknowledged it out loud. It was easier to ignore, to pretend nothing was happening. After all, nothing was really happening, was it? Still, when I went home to Tom, I found it harder to be present. My mind kept drifting to Jack. The conversations we shared, the way his voice seemed to fill the spaces that Tom's words no longer reached. And with each passing day, I could feel myself becoming more distant from the man I had married. It wasn't intentional, not at first, but the absence of connection between Tom and me had become so much more apparent. I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. I didn't know how to tell him that the silence between us felt heavier than I could carry. One evening, after a long day at work, Jack invited me to grab a drink. It was casual, just a friendly offer, but I found myself agreeing without hesitation. Tom was at home, reading, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside of me. I had convinced myself it was harmless, just a drink. But the moment Jack and I found a small, dimly lit corner of the bar, I felt something shift. There was an electricity between us that I hadn't expected. Not in an overt way, but subtle, like the quiet pulse of something both dangerous and exciting. We didn't speak of anything profound, just ordinary things, work, life, but the connection was undeniable. It was the way his eyes met mine, as though he could see parts of me I had forgotten about, parts that had been buried for so long under the weight of routine. We didn't touch, not yet, but when he laughed, that laugh that always made my heart flutter, I felt something stir within me. It was as if, for the first time in years, I was reminded of what it was like to feel seen, to feel alive in a way that wasn't tethered to obligation or comfort. That night, I returned home to Tom, my heart heavy with the knowledge that something had changed. I wasn't sure what it meant, but the world felt different now, shifted ever so slightly in a way I couldn't reverse. The next few days felt like a blur. I told myself that nothing had changed, that everything was fine, that it was just a drink with a colleague. But the guilt began to creep in. I was no longer sure of myself. Every time Tom reached out to me, I could feel a space between us, a chasm that seemed to widen every time I saw Jack's face. Tom had no idea, of course. He was still the same, kind, steady, reliable. He greeted me with a smile, asked about my day, and I answered, trying to find the words that felt true. But something inside me was shifting, and I wasn't sure how to stop it. At night, when Tom reached for me, I felt a pang of discomfort. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or desire that twisted inside me, but it was there. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, as if I were betraying something I hadn't even realized I was losing. I didn't know when it happened, but I found myself alone with Jack in his car, parked beneath a street lamp on a quiet evening. It wasn't planned. In fact, it hadn't even been discussed. It was just a moment, a brief pause in time that seemed to stretch on forever. He had been talking, his voice low and soothing, when our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken that pulled me in. Before I knew it, the space between us had narrowed, and his hand was gently resting on mine. I didn't pull away. I didn't know why. Perhaps it was the way his touch felt like a lifeline in a world that had begun to feel too suffocating. His fingers were warm, and I could feel the beat of his pulse through his skin, like a steady reminder that I was alive, that I was real. And then it happened. A kiss. Soft, hesitant at first, but then it deepened, the world outside fading into the background. In that moment, there was no Tom, no marriage, no guilt. There was only the feeling of being seen, of being touched, in a way that felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced in years. When it ended, it wasn't with words. It was a silent understanding. I wasn't sure what to do with what had just happened. I didn't know what it meant. But I knew that I had crossed a line, and I couldn't go back. The next days were filled with a kind of confusion I hadn't expected. When I saw Tom, his steady presence felt suffocating, like a reminder of something I no longer recognized. And when I saw Jack, the spark was still there, but now it was accompanied by a weight I couldn't ignore. What was I doing? What had I done? It was as though I was living two lives at once, one where I was Tom's wife, and one where I was someone else, someone lost in the attention Jack gave me. Neither felt fully real. Neither felt like it could be sustained. I stood in front of the mirror one evening, staring at the woman in it. Who was she? Who was I? Tom was still here, still loving, still present. And Jack. Jack was a force of change, a reminder of something more, something I wasn't sure I could ever have with Tom again. But how could I choose? How could I turn my back on everything I had known with Tom? And yet, how could I deny what Jack had awakened in me? I didn't know who to stay with, or if I even knew who I was anymore. I didn't have the answers. All I had was the weight of two lives and the unbearable silence that filled the space between them.